The next morning, Jada Thompson walked into Hayes Enterprises with the quiet confidence that had begun to unsettle Richard Hayes. Every step measured, every glance calm, and the office seemed to sense the shift in power. Whispers following her as colleagues exchanged looks of cautious admiration and surprise, knowing that today could be another test of her patience and skill, and Richard Hayes, sitting behind his imposing desk, clenched his jaw, realizing that his attempts to intimidate her had failed repeatedly, and with each passing day, her calm intelligence only made his arrogance appear weaker, and Jada settled at her desk, carefully organizing her assignments, reviewing the charts and reports, and double-checking every detail, while Marcus Thompson observed quietly from his office, his presence a protective force that radiated through the room, making Richard Hayes fidget slightly as he tried to assert control over a situation slipping from his grasp. And as the day unfolded, Richard decided to publicly criticize Jada for a minor oversight in a report, believing that this would finally rattle her composure, and he called her to his desk in front of the team, his voice sharp, words loaded with arrogance, intending to humiliate her in front of everyone. But Jada approached with her usual calm, responding with clarity, confidence, and facts that left no room for doubt. And the other interns watched in awe as she turned his criticism into an opportunity to showcase her skill and intelligence. And Richard's smirk faded, replaced by a tightening tension that no amount of bluster could hide. And as the confrontation continued, Marcus Thompson quietly stood behind Jada, his eyes focused, a silent warning to anyone thinking of crossing her, and the room felt the electric energy of unspoken authority. The tension so thick it could be cut with a knife, and the staff whispered to each other, some secretly recording the event, sensing that this day would be remembered as a turning point. And even as Richard Hayes tried to regain control, his words became less sharp, his arrogance faltering under the quiet yet undeniable strength of Jada Thompson. And when she finally walked back to her desk, her head held high, the office buzzed with relief and admiration. Colleagues exchanging glances that said she had earned more than respect. She had earned their quiet allegiance. And Richard Hayes, now sitting back in his chair, fumed silently, realizing that every attempt to break her had only made her stronger, more confident, and untouchable in her dignity. And outside the office, Marcus had already begun preparing a formal report documenting the repeated humiliations and misconduct, ensuring that his sister would be fully protected. And Jada, unaware of the exact steps her brother was taking, felt a quiet surge of empowerment, knowing that with her skill, intelligence, and Marcus' protection, she could face anything. And that night, as she reflected on the day, she allowed herself a small moment of pride and satisfaction. The satisfaction of knowing that her perseverance had begun to shift the balance of power, that her dignity could not be challenged, and that the arrogance of Richard Hayes was no match for courage, intelligence, and family loyalty. And for you watching, stay subscribed, because the next chapters will reveal shocking confrontations, justice served, and the triumph of strength over cruelty that will leave you on the edge of your seat. The following morning, Jada Thompson entered Hayes Enterprises with the quiet determination that had become her signature, each step measured, each glance calm and unwavering, and the office seemed to hold its breath, sensing that the tension between her and Richard Hayes had reached a new level. And Richard, sitting behind his large mahogany desk, tapped his pen nervously, trying to maintain an air of control. But the aura of authority and composure that Jada radiated made him fidget, his usual arrogance faltering under the unspoken power she now carried. And as she began her tasks, reviewing reports and preparing presentations with meticulous attention, colleagues watched in quiet admiration, whispering amongst themselves, some secretly noting how she had endured humiliation yet remained strong. And Richard, frustrated by his inability to unsettle her, called an emergency team meeting, intending to assert dominance in front of everyone. But as Jada entered the conference room, her calm confidence filled the space, and every eye in the room turned toward her, sensing that today would not be an ordinary confrontation. And he began to speak, his tone sharp, words loaded with entitlement, attempting to criticize her work and undermine her credibility in front of her peers. But Jada met each statement with composed, factual responses that highlighted her intelligence, professionalism, and the effort she had poured into her tasks. And as the meeting progressed, Richard's frustration became more visible, his face flushing, his words sharper yet less effective, while Jada's calm demeanor seemed to grow stronger. Each argument she presented not only defending her work, but exposing the pettiness and arrogance in his attacks, and the other interns watched in stunned silence, some whispering quietly. Realizing that she was not just surviving the situation, she was commanding respect without raising her voice. And Marcus Thompson, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, noted every detail, his protective instincts flaring, ready to step in if necessary, but confident that his sister's strength and intelligence would carry her through. And as Richard Hayes continued his attempts to intimidate, the room's atmosphere thickened. Each employee feeling the silent authority Marcus brought, the unshakable strength that Jada exuded, and the growing realization that Richard had underestimated not just her skill, but her support, her resilience, and the consequences of his arrogance. And halfway through the meeting, a sudden email alert appeared on the projector screen, revealing a formal complaint filed against Richard Hayes, meticulously documented by Marcus with witness statements, video evidence, and detailed reports of his repeated humiliations toward Jada. And the room went silent, the weight of justice hanging in the air, as Richard's face turned pale, his arrogance crumbling under the undeniable proof. While Jada remained calm, her head held high, her quiet smile betraying nothing, but internally she felt vindicated, knowing that the moment of reckoning had arrived. And as Marcus stepped forward, his presence commanding, he calmly stated that the behavior displayed by Richard Hayes was unacceptable and that appropriate actions would be taken, the room hanging on every word, and the other interns exchanged glances of relief and admiration. Realizing that this was more than an office confrontation, it was a lesson in resilience, dignity, and justice, and Richard, powerless in that moment, could only nod, defeated, while Jada felt a mixture of pride, relief, and anticipation for the change this day would bring. And as the meeting ended, the office slowly returned to its rhythm, the tension replaced by a newfound respect for Jada, her strength and intelligence shining brighter than ever. And for you watching, subscribe now, because the next chapters will take you deeper into the shocking consequences, emotional confrontations, and the ultimate triumph of courage, family, and justice that you won't want to miss. The following week at Hayes Enterprises felt almost surreal as Jada Thompson entered the office, the air still thick with the aftermath of the previous confrontation, whispers trailing behind her like invisible shadows, and Richard Hayes, sitting rigidly at his desk, struggled to maintain a facade of control, his usual arrogance replaced by tension and unease. And every step Jada took toward her desk carried the quiet authority of someone who had endured humiliation and emerged stronger, smarter, and more respected. And as she began reviewing the day's assignments, meticulously checking every detail, the interns and staff watched in awe, some exchanging glances of admiration, others quietly relieved that justice and dignity were slowly being restored. And Richard, determined to regain some semblance of power, attempted to micromanage her again, his tone sharp and his words laced with entitlement. But each time he spoke, Jada calmly responded with clarity, intelligence, and evidence-backed reasoning that left no room for argument. And with each response, his frustration deepened, visible in the tight line of his jaw, the slight tremor in his hands, and the way he avoided eye contact with the team that now clearly supported her. And Marcus Thompson, standing quietly near the entrance, observed the unfolding scene, his calm but authoritative presence ensuring that Richard Hayes' arrogance could not regain footing. And the energy in the office seemed to shift, employees leaning slightly closer to witness what they knew would be a turning point, a moment when power, courage, and intelligence would finally eclipse entitlement and cruelty. And as the morning progressed, Jada was assigned a new project, a high-stakes client presentation that Richard hoped would expose weaknesses, humiliate her further, or force a mistake. But Jada approached it as she always did, with preparation, precision, and patience, her every action demonstrating not only skill but unwavering composure. And as the time for the presentation arrived, the conference room filled with clients, staff, and Richard Hayes himself, his eyes flicking nervously toward Jada, who stood before them, calm, articulate, and confident, delivering a flawless presentation that impressed every client in the room, drawing nods of approval, smiles of respect, and subtle whispers of admiration, while Richard's attempts to interject were met with quiet, precise answers that left him looking increasingly flustered and powerless, and Marcus stood behind her, his proud gaze never leaving her, silently reinforcing that her dignity and reputation were fully protected. And as the presentation concluded, clients approached Jada to compliment her professionalism and intelligence, asking questions and shaking her hand, while Richard Hayes retreated to his office, fuming quietly, realizing that every effort to undermine her had failed spectacularly, and the office erupted into hushed celebration, employees exchanging smiles and whispered congratulations, some secretly taking videos to remember the moment that injustice had been challenged and defeated. And Jada, for the first time that week, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, feeling a mixture of relief, pride, and empowerment that came from knowing she had not only survived but excelled under pressure, while Marcus quietly reminded her that this was only the beginning, that strength, courage, and family would continue to guide her as she faced challenges ahead. And Richard Hayes, sitting alone in his office, stared at the empty conference room, finally understanding that the arrogance he had relied on was meaningless in the face of intelligence, resilience, and support. And for you watching, subscribe now, because the next chapter will bring the shocking conclusion, emotional justice, and the ultimate triumph of courage, family, and dignity over cruelty that will leave you inspired and amazed. The following day at Hayes Enterprises felt like the calm before a storm, but for Jada Thompson, it was the moment she had been preparing for, every step she took toward her desk radiating quiet confidence, every glance calm and unwavering, while Richard Hayes sat at his desk, fuming silently, his arrogance replaced by fear and uncertainty, knowing that the tide had turned and that every attempt to humiliate her had only strengthened her resolve. And as the morning progressed, Richard summoned Jada to his office, hoping to salvage what little control remained, but from the moment she entered, her composed presence filled the room, each step measured, each word deliberate, leaving no doubt that she would not be intimidated, and Richard began his usual condescending tone, attempting to belittle her work. But Jada responded with calm authority, pointing out the flaws in his arguments with clarity, intelligence, and unshakable logic, and Marcus Thompson, standing silently behind the door, his eyes sharp and protective, reminded Richard with a single glance that he had underestimated the strength of both Jada and the family that supported her. And as the confrontation escalated, Richard tried to assert dominance, raising his voice, gesturing aggressively. But Jada remained unshaken, answering every accusation with poise and undeniable facts, and the tension in the room became almost unbearable, every second a test of patience, courage, and integrity, and finally, with a steady voice, Marcus stepped fully into the office, placing his badge and presence between Jada and Richard, his calm but firm tone stating clearly that the days of intimidation and disrespect were over, and Richard froze, realizing that his arrogance had no place in this office any longer, and that every action he had taken against Jada would now be held accountable. And as Marcus outlined the consequences, including formal reports to the board and potential legal action, Richard Hayes' face drained of color, his entitlement shattered, while Jada stood silently beside him, her calm smile showing not triumph over a man, but over the injustice that had been allowed to fester far too long. And the office outside had gathered quietly, sensing the gravity of the moment, employees whispering, some even crying quietly at the sight of dignity, intelligence, and resilience prevailing over cruelty. And as Richard Hayes was escorted to face the consequences of his actions, Jada felt a rush of relief, validation and empowerment, knowing that her courage, skill and patience had not only protected her dignity, but exposed the arrogance and prejudice that had sought to undermine her. And Marcus looked at her with pride, a silent acknowledgement of her strength, his protective presence always standing behind her, and the lesson of the day was clear. Resilience, intelligence, and calm courage can dismantle arrogance, cruelty, and racism, and standing up with dignity often inspires change in ways that anger never could. And Jada returned to her desk, colleagues now treating her with the respect she had always deserved, some quietly congratulating her, others simply offering supportive smiles, while she reflected on the journey, realizing that enduring hardship with grace, seeking justice calmly, and never compromising integrity was the true measure of strength. And the sun, setting outside the office, windows cast golden light across her desk as she allowed herself a small, victorious smile, knowing that this chapter of her life had been written with courage, resilience, and unwavering dignity. And for you watching, remember that standing tall in the face of injustice matters, that calm courage can change the world around you, and that family support is often the shield that allows strength to shine. And if you have felt inspired by Jada's journey, subscribe now, because the next stories will take you on more journeys of courage, justice, and triumph that will leave you moved, motivated, and amazed.